It's another Monday, and boy is there a lot to talk about this week. The season just started, so I don't really have a lot of super innovative tricks, but here's a few that I found are quite useful to know. The first tech talk is about the second boss in Vortex Pinnacle. Altairus is a difficult boss that pumps out a lot of group wide damage. One mechanic in particular is where you need to step into a tornado to go up to avoid an expanding ring. Taking the tornado itself actually does a lot of damage to you, and you really want to minimize the amount of damage you take throughout this fight. An option here for some classes is to use your mobility to go over these rings. On mages you can use blink, and on demon hunters or maybe even Draktheirs you can use double jump. I'm sure there are other tools that you could use. One that comes to mind is heroic leap. Maybe take some time to test it yourself. Do a low vortex key and see what lets you skip this mechanic. The next tip isn't one that I found myself, but one that I saw on Wowhead that I think is really important. This one's to do with the last boss in Neltharion's Lair. Tuning of the dungeon aside, mechanically the bosses are not too complex, but the last boss in particular can be quite difficult because of the ad. Every time the ad makes a move, it does damage to the entire party, so you want it to move as little as possible. An important mechanic on this fight is that you want to drag the ad through a crystal. Dragging the ad through the crystal will stun it, and make it take 100% more damage for that duration. So a cool little trick you can do here is the tank will hold the boss right next to the crystal. Have the boss's left shoulder face the crystal, and the boss spawns the ad right in the crystal. This is because the boss always spawns the ad on his left. This way you can stun the ad immediately when it spawns. The ad will not take a single step, and you can kill it very quickly right after. A very important trick to reduce the amount of damage taken in this fight. And the last tip, which I saved for last because it's not really a tip, this one is a handy little WeakAura you can have for the last boss in Vortex Pinnacle. Jumping in World of Warcraft is really something else, and you don't really give it much thought, until the game puts a mechanic where you need to jump to survive. Assad is just that. The last boss has a mechanic called Static Cling, a long cast where at the end of the cast, you need to be mid-air or you will take a lot of damage and be snared. Oftentimes I find it quite difficult to be ready for this when it happens. So this WeakAura counts down the moment until you need to jump, giving you a pretty much 2-second window to jump. It's really useful and I really can't see doing this boss without it. I'll put it in the description. Okay, we're done with the tips and now we're heading straight into the updates. There are a lot of updates and I'll divide it into 3 parts. The first part is pre-season changes. So in the days before the patch came out, they actually did a lot more dungeon tuning. And now we know that the dungeon tuning was a mistake. Boy oh boy. This patch was the one that buffed many of the bosses in Neltharion's Lair to be much harder than they were in PTR. Specifically, Nerfs, the infamous worm boss, had some of their abilities almost double in damage. This was a big mistake, which they did fortunately revert, which I will elaborate on later. There was a typo in the blue post detailing the Resto Druid and Holy Priest buffs. The raid trinket that was nerfed not to scale to haste anymore was buffed a little bit, and of course more Aberrus tuning. Nothing too much out of the ordinary. But here's a big one for demon hunters, specifically for vengeance demon hunters. There was a tech that was discovered on PTR right before the patch that was very endearingly dubbed by the VDH community as Lunchboxing. In short, Lunchboxing made it so that basically, demon hunter tanks can have their fiery brand, their major mitigation cooldown, last almost forever. The process to do this was very involved and was quite complicated, maybe too complicated for the majority of the player base. And so Blizzard decided to cut it down before it even started, making it so fiery brands only last at most 10 seconds. Overall, this wouldn't impact the majority of the community, as this would only really play out in really high keys, 25s to 26s. I can't say that I'm too disappointed that it's gone, but I'm sure some of the higher level players might feel this loss. Okay, with the pre-season changes out of the way, let's talk about the tuning changes for the current patch. I'll try to discuss them sequentially, but my bookkeeping system isn't very good. First of them is Freehold got a small buff. Harlan's Suite, the last boss, was changed so that one of his abilities behaved properly. When the boss hit 60% health, his whirling dagger is supposed to hit multiple players, but previously it only hit one. They fixed this, and now every player will receive this dot. It is a considerable amount of damage, so there will be more burden on the healers. Okay, the next one is one that I really enjoy. It's about Neltharion's Lair. On release, Neltharion's Lair was a mess. It was disgustingly overtuned. Nerfs, the third boss, on a 16 could potentially do 360,000 damage to a player in less than half a second. That is just way too much for a 16. So they nerfed Toxic Wretch by 30% and Hurling Rocks by 20%, a fair amount. They also nerfed Dargrul, the last boss. Flame Gout now fires less frequently, and Lava Geysers only last 60 seconds now, instead of indefinite. A cast time has also been extended from 0.2 seconds to 2.5 seconds for his ultimate, Magma Wave. Really good, because in the past, if you were not already behind a crystal and he started his ultimate, you're basically dead. And last in this balance patch is Underrot, where they buffed a magic effect to now be able to affect ranged players. Just a small thing. The next balance patch is about Vortex Pinnacle and Brackenhide Hollow. The second boss, Altairus, did a lot of damage to the group through Biting Cold, a persistent rot damage that applied to the whole group for the entire fight. They cut this down by a whopping 25%. That is absurd. This is a great change as it puts a lot of the burden off the healers. But don't be fooled, this boss is still quite difficult, especially on Tyrannical weeks. Brackenhide had its last boss, the Catriarch Rathai, see a lot of changes. Decaying Strength, the buff she gets when she saps the players, now seems to have a maximum duration. I'm not sure how true this is, as my most recent run did not display this at all. Rathai had her Tank Buster Decay Strike nerfed by 33%, specifically the Absorb portion, so now she applies a Healing Absorb that is considerably smaller. And finally, Withering Rot was nerfed significantly. It does 20% less damage, and now, instead of reducing your damage done by 5% per stack, it only does it by 2%. Yet another set of really welcome changes to outlier bosses so far. But wait, there's more. Neltharius got a round of the nerfs on the last boss, Warlord Sargha. The curse you receive when you pick up a treasure has had its damage nerfed by 20%. And the curse no longer stacks, so if you don't have a D-curse and you pick up multiple treasures, you won't just die. All treasures can also now be cast while moving, and the projectile speed for the swirlies has been reduced. All very welcome changes. Then came more nerfs for Vortex Pinnacle. This time is for the last boss, Assad. The boss now summons the ad very slightly closer, from 22.5 yards to 20 yards. His Chain Lightning had its damage nerfed by 10%, and the Nova ads he spawned that do continuous damage to the whole group had its health reduced by 17.4%. Changes that will certainly make this boss fight significantly easier. And then there were more hotfixes. There's just so many of these, it's crazy. While this one mostly fixed bugged interactions between 4 sets, a few small changes were made to dungeons. In Freehold, the Shark Puncher's Ripper Punch no longer targets pets. In Neltharion's Lair, Neuraxis was nerfed again, making it so the rocks no longer scale as the fight progresses. The removal of one of the treasures from Warlord Sargha's treasure pool, and a slight nerf to the last boss in Vortex Pinnacle. That pretty much covers everything from last week to this week, but there were a few things omitted from the earlier Wowhead posts that I would like to highlight. Rathai's ultimate now begins building up before she finishes her current stacks of Decaying Strength, making the fight much less of a feedback loop. It still is a feedback loop to a certain extent, but now gaining stacks of the debuff isn't the end of the world. Treemouth has his absorb less damage, it's great, and more recently, a few movement speed buffs were added to Vortex Pinnacle and Halls of Infusion. In Vortex Pinnacle, whenever you take one of the slipstreams, you will now gain a 100% movement speed buff forever, basically, until you enter combat. The same happens in Halls of Infusion, where if you jump down from the right path and take the skip, you will gain a 100% movement speed buff. Both very welcome changes because the dungeon is just so long. A wipe may now no longer necessarily mean that the key is bricked. I think that's everything. If I did miss anything, be sure to leave it in the comments. And finally is class tuning changes. Coming next reset, they plan on doing a few changes to a few classes. Specifically Frost DK, getting a pretty sizable buff, Havoc Demon Hunter also getting a buff to their single target, and a few minor changes to other classes. Most notably, Frost Mage is getting a 4% overall damage buff. Now that we're done with the current patch, we talk about the next patch. A lot of news about the 10.1.5 patch has come out. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. The first and probably biggest is that there's going to be a confirmed third new Evoker spec. It will be called Augmentation, and its focus, unsurprisingly, will be to augment other DPS. It is considered a DPS itself, but it does act more like a hybrid between a DPS and a support. That's awesome. I don't know too much about Evokers myself, but if you're interested, I'll leave the links in the description. News of the Megadungeon has come out. It's going to be called Dawn of the Infinite, and it looks like we're gonna deal with some shenanigans with the Infinite Dragonflight. Maybe go back in time, maybe fight Galakrond, I don't know. We even get to fight Evil Chromie, I think. If nothing else, it will at least be aesthetically very pleasing. And then, more big news, they're reworking mages. They're throwing away Rune of Power entirely, moving the damage you get from Rune of Power straight up to the class, in the form of a 15% damage buff to all mages. That is the best news I've heard in weeks. It's no secret that Rune of Power makes Mage quite clunky to play, and is a good reason why there are so few mages around these days. I can't wait to see where they go with this. They also plan on introducing 2 new abilities: Mass Barrier, where you grant all allies nearby a barrier, or Mass Invisibility, giving all nearby players invisibility. I mean, that's awesome. You can now have a mage in your group rather than a rogue. How crazy is that? This is really good, and I'm really looking forward to see what they do with fire mages. At the moment, they've only announced the rework for Arcane Mage, so we'll expect Fire and Frost to come. They also plan on reworking Holy Paladin. I don't have much experience with Holy Paladin. I played a bit of it in Season 3 of Shadowlands. It didn't catch my attention too much, and it doesn't catch my attention too much today, so if that's something that concerns you, feel free to read the link in the description. They have also come out with early patch notes for 10.1.5, just minor changes and in-depth discussions on the new class reworks. If that interests you, feel free to read it yourself. That's all the news this week, I think. I really hope no new news comes out after I post this video, because that would suck. This video is already quite long, so I won't talk too much about my week in WoW, even though there is actually a lot to talk about. Man, this past week was hard. I knew keys would be hard this new season, but they were so hard. With, of course, a few exceptions. I think Freehold, Underrot, and Uldaman are 3 of the easiest dungeons this season so far. Following those 3 would be Halls of Infusion, I think? And then the other 4 are just, ugh. I'm having a lot of fun doing keys. The runs can sometimes be super chaotic, but they are always so much fun. Gotta say though, some of the dungeons are really tuned quite poorly. Neltharion's Lair was quite difficult all throughout. Vortex Pinnacle was disgusting as a healer. There was so much damage just getting pumped out to the entire group. No surprise that they changed it a lot over the past week. Brackenhide's last boss was a mess before the nerfs. It was really hard to meet the DPS check in 16 keys and higher. The run I posted just a few days ago was before the nerf, and we barely killed it by the skin of our teeth. It was way overtuned. And finally, Neltharus. I've done like 20-25 keys over the past week. It is a bit excessive, but it's the first week, I can excuse myself. And I only ran Neltharus like twice. I don't know what it is, I'm just really unlucky, I never get the key. But oh man, on a 17, that elephant boss hits so hard. And positioning is so important. Even a slight mistake, the room is just filled with lava and you're just overwhelmed, you just die. Mechanically, I think Neltharus is a challenging dungeon. I think it's definitely one of the harder dungeons at the moment. Even past the nerfs on Warlord Sargha, the dungeon is still quite difficult. I've been primarily playing my Discipline Priest over the past few days. I've gotten quite a few eye level upgrades on it. I got the Spoils of Neltharus, a very sought after trinket. My eye level has gone up to 424, very respectable. The thing is, we can't unequip our tier yet, because generally, our Season 1 tier sets are still quite potent. This makes it slightly awkward to gear up in this new season, compounded by the fact that we won't get the catalyst for another 5 weeks. It's not much of a complaint, but it does make you have to raid to get tier. Not the worst thing in the world, I guess. Unsurprisingly, I raid on my mage, my fire mage, and I will say it is not performing as well as I'd hoped. It seems slightly difficult to play when I don't know the encounter very well. I'm kinda spending half my brain power doing my rotation, half my brain power doing the mechanics. But our raid team needs a mage, and I will oblige. I just need to get around to doing M+ on it. I've kind of been neglecting it, been healing most of my groups. And healing is hard. I mean, maybe it's because nobody knows the mechanics so they take a lot of avoidable damage. Maybe it's poor tuning. Start of the season is always rough on the healers, but it has been quite difficult so far. I'm sure it will only get better from here. I think my highest key this week so far is an untimed 18. Mostly unfortunate plays. I'm sure if we had another go at it we could time it, but not today. How far did you go? How well did you do? Did you have fun this first week? Always happy to hear from you. Be sure to leave it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like or subscribe, and I'll catch you in my next weekly WoW recap.